Hello, and thank you for joining us on this month's Ask Andrew show, Canada's first Facebook live streaming family law question and answer show. My name is Andrew Feldstein, and I'm the principal of the Greater Toronto area family law firm, Feldstein Family Law Group. Both myself and the entire firm practice exclusively in the area of family law. And today our special guest is Dr. Pamela Wilansky. She's from Framework Therapy and Assessment Center. They provide a comprehensive spectrum of mental health care services for children, adolescents, couples, and families in the GTA. And she's here to speak to us today about what parents can do to be proactive about their children's mental health needs during family breakdown, as well as other issues. I wanted to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I wanted to start off because, we gave some words, and I think of parents who come to me all the time and they're in a really difficult situation with their children. And one of the questions they ask frequently right at the beginning is, how do we tell the kids about separation? And do I think that the kids should go into some form of counseling to deal with separation? What would you say about that? Or how would you answer that question?
Well, I definitely think there's no right or wrong answer to that. I think every family, of course, needs to talk about it. The question is how many details to provide at the beginning versus to let questions answer and percolate. The other thing, too, is in terms of getting counseling or not, if you are ever in doubt, I always say consult a professional, and then they can better help to determine whether or not they think it's needed or not.
Because I find what typically happens in a lot of my cases is you have one parent who is suggesting that their children should go into counseling to deal with the breakup of the family. And the other parent is sitting there in a very objectionist type of position saying, no, it's not going to happen. The children don't need it. May even go to the children and say, the other parent is saying you should go and they're saying you need help or that you're crazy. So what do you say to the parent who wants to enroll the child in counseling to help them through this difficult time?
I think if they feel it's necessary because they're seeing a lot of changes in their children or something that they're worried about in terms of what they're seeing. So any major changes, of course, a change in a family will produce some changes in the children, but to talk about what it is exactly that they're hoping that would be needed in terms of the counseling.
And what type of change should parents who are going through a separation, or any parents, be looking for in order to see whether or not they need help for their kids?
So for me, it would be anything that is out of the quote unquote norm for their child. So if their child used to be a kid that hung out with their friends a couple of times a week and are now decreasing that activity and going out maybe once a week or every couple of weeks, if they used to love playing different types of games, whether it be baseball, football, whatever they used to do, or were interested in art, if that then has changed a lot and they're not looking forward to doing those types of things. If you used to have a child that used to be a huge talker and would tell you all the different things that are on their mind and suddenly start talking to you about different things that are going on, those are just some of the few things that I'd be looking for.
Okay, now what would you say to the parent who says, I don't want to enroll my child in counseling and I think it's a bunch of nonsense? Because that's what some parents will say.
Right. For sure. And I think one does have to respect that counseling can be difficult for certain people. I try to figure out the question of why they feel that way. A lot of times there's misconceptions as to what counseling actually is. And I would really talk about that. Or maybe they had a bad experience with a particular counselor. Different people gel with different types of personalities and not everybody is a fit for them. So I think it really is finding out what is the rationale and the reason behind why they don't want to see someone.
And where would you be involved with the family going through divorce and separation?
So I sometimes see adults in my practice that might be trying to decide, should I separate or not from my partner? And so I might be even involved in terms of even talking to an adult ahead of time in terms of what's going into their factor, what's going into the decision-making process they have. Sometimes I'm seeing people that come in after separation and divorce and sort of some children that are coming in that might be struggling, or even parents in terms of how do I parent children going through it. So I can be involved in anything from people going through the ideas of it to all the way to post-separation.
And I'm going to focus on one thing you said there for now, which is you said that you give advice to parents who are going through the separation on how to parent the children. Do you deal, I'm assuming when a parent comes to you in that situation, it's because they're having issues at parenting. Would it be fair to say it's fairly common that one of the issues could be different rules in different homes and children being influenced by the other parent?
Most definitely. That's one of the most common causes of complaint is that there's two different rules in terms of parenting, like electronic use, let's say, bedtime, all different types of things that might be very different in one household than the other household.
And what would be your advice to that type of parent?
There really is, it really depends upon the individual case in terms of which client is talking about what types of things. Usually it's best for me to talk with both people and try to help problem solve around what it is that they both want in terms of that case.
Okay, and do you sometimes advise one parent and you're only counseling one parent who's going through the separation?
Yeah, sometimes I definitely go through that, and it's trying to problem solve with a parent in terms of what priorities to place in terms of what they might talk about with their partner, their previous partner.
Because one of the areas, maybe it's because I do litigation, so I deal with conflict.
Yes.
So I'm looking at it from the perspective of conflict. And the two common themes I hear in conflict is you have one parent who says, I think my former spouse's bedtime or screen time rules are ridiculous, so I have different rules at my house. And the other would be the other parent saying, I think it's ridiculous that my former spouse doesn't want to follow the reasonable rules that I set at my house.
Right.
So I'm wondering how you would deal with each one of those parents, even though they're polar opposites.
So I know ideally people would love to have that even when people aren't in a separation or divorce, that two parents would be on the same page in terms of all those different types of rules when it comes to children. However, part of life is dealing with differences in terms of what happens. And so sometimes just because there's one rule in one house doesn't necessarily mean there has to be the same rule in the other house. The question is, how do you equip your children to deal with all those differences that might happen going from one family to the other family home?
And what kind of advice would you give that parent in terms of equipping the child or children?
So very different. It would so if it's sort of agreed with the particular client that I'm counseling that really this is not an issue that can be resolved with the other person. Obviously, I try to encourage them to talk to the other parent to see if this issue can be resolved. If it's not going to be resolved, it's being realistic in terms of then what can happen going forward. It might be every time a child comes back from another parent's house, it's just sitting down with the child and going over what the rules are in terms of that particular house. Okay, yes, in one parent's house, this is the rules, and now you're here, and these are what the rules are, because it's kind of nice to give the kids a heads up, because it's often hard for them to remember, oh yeah, shoot, now I can't do this, or I can do this.
Now, what I also find interesting in terms of the rules that I hear from some clients is the former spouse will attempt to enforce their rules in the other parent's house. And you see that through text messages, through cell phones. I often say to clients, in a way, as a separated spouse, the cell phone can be the absolute worst invention that's ever happened, because it allows the other parent to really try to impose their views on the child. And how do you tell parents to deal with that?
Most definitely. I think the cell phone is for any parent the nemesis in terms of dealing with kids that have it, particularly when you do have those types of things happening. So first and foremost, it's always try not to put the child in the middle and try to deal with the other partner, co-parent, in terms of how are we going to do this? What are the rules that we could try to do going forward? If it becomes really unruly and there is really difficulties between that, then I would suggest seeing a professional to help mediate those types of conversations with the other partner.
Now, I agree that your suggestion of mediation makes sense, but unfortunately, when those things are going on, it's usually in a relationship where there's conflict, and one side usually doesn't want to go to mediation because it's consistent with that type of personality. So what do you tell? I'm trying to focus in on the client who is in the situation where the former spouse doesn't want to listen after discussion, doesn't want to go to mediation, but is on the receiving end of that parent who is trying to parent in the other one's home.
it's really it's setting the boundaries then with the child, right? So first of all, when I meant mediation, I meant in terms of having a professional, like a psychologist, actually mediate between the two of them. I didn't mean the legal one.
No. I agree that I understood you meant a professional, but if one side doesn't want to go, they're not going.
For sure. So then it's sort of helping the other parent. Then in terms of it's helping with the other parent be able to figure out what they're going to do in terms of talking with the actual child about these types of things, and how can they have a conversation with the child about what's happening and get the child's perspective on this.
Okay, and would your advice change if this was about step parents?
In terms of what way?
Well, we have a question from one of our viewers, and to quote, they say, does your advice on this topic change when you are dealing with step parents?
I'm not sure I completely understand, but for me, what it would involve, if they're meaning if a step parent is doing the parenting, to me, it is, it's whatever's agreed upon between the parent and the step parent in terms of how they are going to parent the children that are in their home. So some parents with their current spouse, that might not be the parent of the child, they need to discuss what are the ground rules. Is there going to be equal parenting? Does one discipline more? Does the other one do less? Sort of what those ground rules are, and then they need to follow that.
Okay, and one of the things I think of my clients also talk to me about is the issue of clothes in homes, and whether or not the clothes should be in both parents' home in an equal parenting schedule, or if there should be a bag going back and forth. Because what I hear from some clients is they struggle with that, in the sense one parent tries to control the clothes and just wants a bag, versus the other parent who is suggesting it should be in both homes.
I think whatever works best for the family is what the right answer is. So if for one family it works better having clothes going back and forth, then that is the right answer. If it's having two separate clothes in two separate places, then that's what's best. I really don't think there's a one shoe fits all, one size fits all in this case. It really has to be with what works best for that particular family that minimizes the conflict that the children are exposed to.
Okay, now I know one thing we've been talking about there is minimizing conflict. In your practice that you're familiar with, what would you say is your most common involvement with a family that's gone through divorce? Is there one type of timing wise that you're usually involved, or would that be an unfair statement?
Yeah, I'm trying to think about that. I really can't know. It really comes at all different stages. And sometimes people are coming in, like I mentioned, that they're both co-parents that are struggling to figure this out. Sometimes it's one parent suggesting that a child come in because the child is having difficulty struggling with it. It really, really varies. Sometimes they're coming in just because the child is struggling. It's not necessarily for the divorce, the separation, and they're both involved in terms of just trying to seek mental health.
Okay, now we have another question that came in. Does your advice, sorry, it's clarifying the earlier question. This was the one with the step parents. Would it be about in clarifying terms of enforcing rules? So in terms of your advice that you gave about enforcing rules, would you agree that that would apply with step parents as well?
So I'm thinking that what the question is should a step parent enforce rules or not? I'm guessing is
I think that's what I'm reading into it as well.
And I get that often. That is a very common question: is should step parents do it or not? Again, I really don't think there is a standard answer for any of these types of questions. Some families work really well. The step parent might even be the primary active parent that's there during the most time when the child is awake. And so therefore it might be that just by de facto that person is the one that is actually doing the most of the parenting. And so therefore it would make sense that they enforce a lot of the rules. Sometimes the step parent is not really involved in that or doesn't feel comfortable themselves actually enforcing the rules. And if that's the case, then I would say it really varies.
Well, I think it's also challenging to be a step parent because it's very easy to be met with the argument from a child of, well, you're not my parent, so you don't make the rules for me.
Yeah.
And if you want to take that one step further, when the child returns to the other parent's home, it's easy for the child to go there and complain And they may very well get a very sympathetic ear from the other parent that it was not the step parent's role. So I think it's on very tenuous grounds when a step parent starts to parent in terms of, are they going to have cooperation from the other home in terms of backing up? Because if you're not going to get the cooperation, you may be doomed to failure. I don't know if you'd agree with that type of statement.
Yeah, I think that definitely sometimes happens. And at the same time, I think each family needs to parent in terms of what is right for them, especially when you're talking about a 50-50 kind of situation, that each family needs to decide what makes sense for them. Does it make sense for the step parent to parent, or does it not? And some of those decisions might be influenced by what happens in the other home as well.
I also think, and this may be a generalization, but it's easier to have a step parent being more active the younger the children are when they became the step parent. In the sense that I think if someone were to jump in with a 17 and 15-year-old and become a step parent at that age, I think you're going to have a lot of reluctance from the kids who have their own independent views versus a 5-year-old and 3-year-old that may not remember anything else.
Right. And again, and I think it also depends upon the child a lot too, in terms of their temperament and personality and how easily they follow the rules or don't. As you know, as I have 3 children, and one of my child is very much a rule follower and one is very much not, and one is in between. So I think it also depends upon the personality of the kid.
Absolutely. Now, I've talked about what it's like in terms of a lot of questions about the person who may be on the receiving end of the influence from the other parent. What would you advise a parent who would be coming to you and saying, I'm struggling with the fact that I can't really co-parent with my former spouse because it's bedlam at their home? You know, the lines that I frequently hear is dad lets them or mom lets them watch TV all the time, play video games all the time, stay on their phone. There's no rules, there's no parenting, there's no bedtime, there's no vegetables. That kind of thing. What would you be telling that parent? Because that parent's obviously very nervous about what's happening in the other parent's home. And what would be your advice to them?
Well, I'd really try to explore with them, you know, again, do they have the ability to talk to the other parent about what's sort of going on and why they feel it's important for some of these things. And at the same time, sometimes obviously, like we talked about, it's not possible. After talking about that with them, if it isn't possible, it would really be exploring what they can do at their end to deal with it with the child, in terms of talking to the child about how they're feeling, what they think about the 2 different households, about the 2 different rules, just to gain information, not necessarily in terms of trying to then slam the other parent. It's more so just, how are you coping with this?
And how would you advise that parent when they're on the receiving end of, you know, it's not fair. The other parent lets me play Fortnite all night and you limit me to 1 hour. Obviously not in those words, but
yes.
How would you talk to that parent who's obviously feeling frustrated on the basis of the way things are at the other home?
Sorry, I think my Wi-Fi just cut out for a couple of seconds. I lost you at Fortnite.
Well, how would you react? How would you advise the parent who's complaining that the other parent allows them to play Fortnite, as an example, until bedtime, which is at 10 o'clock, and their bedtime is 8 o'clock? Mm-hmm. And there really are, it's a very structured in one home and not structured in the other home. What advice would you give to that parent in terms of how to deal with the kids and how to cope with that?
So I think first it's validating the child that, you know, yes, there is 2 different rules in 2 different households. And yes, it would be much more fun to play Fortnite there than it is here, until those types of things. And then with the lovingly tough luck, these are the rules here and this is what's sort of going on. But definitely to validate the confusion and to say these are the rules here.
Now, I'm going to give you the comments I've had a lot of my clients say to me when they give that type of answer.
Yeah.
Is, and then my child says, when I tell them these are the rules here, well, I want to go back to the other parent's house. And then they say they feel like they can't set any rules because of that.
For sure. And I also talk about how kids will say those things, whether they're in a separated or divorced home or not. And so kids will balk upon rules and will say, but so-and-so doesn't, and I would rather live with so-and-so and this and that. And so it is common that children do balk at rules and don't like those types of things and would definitely prefer to do it. And how do you understand that and say that, you know, talk again with your kid that I get it, I understand that, and this is what it is.
because I think that advice really works when you're dealing with younger kids because they don't really have any control. And I get the fortnight example, but now let's fast forward and say the child is 15 years old and it's about, I'll give you an example. One parent wants the child home by 10 o'clock on Saturday night, and the other one wants the child home by midnight. And the child is at the parents who's at 10 o'clock and is saying, I want to go stay at daddy's now. I don't want to live here anymore because you have too many rules. Or I want to go live at mommy's because you have too many rules.
Yeah, most definitely. That for sure is a common complaint. And to add also, which applies to this example and also with the kids, it's also explaining why you have those rules and what the rationale behind them is. So with the 15-year-old, I tend to use more so with the older kids, but also works really well with younger kids, is a technique called collaborative problem solving. And so it is restating the problem to the child and then presenting it back to them to help with a solution. So saying that I get it, again, validate that, yeah, it does suck that we have the rules here and at the other house you don't have those rules. And I get why you would want to spend more time there. This is the reason why I have these rules here. This is the reason why perhaps the other parent has the rules there. And what are we going to do about it? Because I would really like you to stay still here, and talking about why you want them to still be in the home, etc.
So I'm going to predict what the answer might be a fair bit of time. Could be, well, I think I should be able to stay out later to mom or dad. It's not fair. I can handle it. So, that's a common question I have where I see parents parenting when they're divorced in fear rather than parenting as a parent. And what I mean by that is you can have two people that when they were married together, they may not have agreed on everything, but somebody would usually acquiesce to the other, and there were rules that were expected to be followed. Now that they're separated and the rules are different, one side may be leveraging that to their advantage over the other, and the parents, I call it parenting in fear, because you're concerned as the child gets older that if you're insisting on rules, that the child is going to choose with their feet and go to the other home.
Yeah. And I use that term very often also with the clients that I see too, in terms of talking about that, right? That what is it that you would normally be doing and how would you be parenting regardless of the separation, divorce? And what again is the rationale? What are your parenting goals? Why did you choose to do things this way? And to talk about what it is that they're hoping to instill in terms of children and why they've chosen those rules and to parent the way that they've chosen. And then how can they decrease their own fears and then parent according to their authentic self. Obviously, in best case scenario, again, it's talking with the other person and being able to try to be a little bit more consistent in terms of some of those major issues. Which is
obviously in parties that are in conflict, and that's what I'm using as the example, sometimes can be very difficult to achieve. Like I can picture in that situation, the parents either text message, email, rarely talk, and one parent says, how come you're allowing our 15-year-old to stay out till midnight? And the response is going to be, because I think they're perfectly good with it.
Right.
And the other parent says, well, maybe we need to have a discussion, and they're going to be met with a brick wall. Yeah. And that's where I think the parenting in fear comes from, because they're really worried about the child walking. Now, I see we got another question, which is, how old does a child need to be in order to benefit from therapy?
And so, sorry, before we get to that question, I'll just sort of say again, in terms of, it's for sure, it's not an easy time to be able to parent according to what you were sort of saying with the teenager, and to definitely parent in fear, because if they're allowed to stay out, for sure, it's a hard pill to swallow. And at the same time, it doesn't necessarily mean that a child would choose when they're not angry, and once the Saturday night has gone by, to still stay with the other parent because they do want to be with them. So what a child says in anger on a Saturday night when they're told to come back before midnight might be very different way they're feeling on a Sunday. And how do you talk about those things, not in the heated moment with your kid, but afterwards as well, when things have calmed on both sides. In terms of the other question, in terms of when do children benefit from therapy, there is no age in terms of benefiting from therapy. There's no rule of thumb that they can't start before an age or after a certain age. There's all different types of therapy. There's play therapy that we do with a lot younger kids, even as young as 3, 4 years of age. And then there's also therapy, more talk therapy that we do with older children. Sometimes therapy can involve the parent and the child together too, particularly for the younger ones as well.
Now, one of the other things I've heard about from clients is one parent moves out of the home, or they both do, and the house gets sold, and one parent is encouraging the child to walk around the house with their phone so they can see what the new house looks like. And then that ends up given to a lawyer of, look at this part of this house or that part of this house, because the other parent is busy snapping photos while the child is doing FaceTime. I can tell you my practice, I tell clients, judges aren't impressed with that kind of thing, and they're not impressed with the ultimate message of you're snapping pictures and getting videos of it. But what do you tell somebody who comes in and says, look how awful the other parent's house is. I got my child to FaceTime me throughout the house.
Yeah. I mean, it's of course very frustrating being on the opposite end of that. I can only imagine that. And it's also talking about with the client that's showing me that, what's the rationale again for it? Are they particularly worried about something? Again, what is it that's provoking them to be doing those types of things?
Okay, because that goes hand in hand where I see parents are doing that kind of thing who keep the location settings on the phone. And I know I've talked to other mental health professionals on the show about that, but some parents feel the need that the location settings need to be on 24/7, 365, whether the child is with them or not with them. And I know I've tried to talk to clients about the fact you can't and shouldn't be doing that when the child's with the other parent.
Right.
And I don't know what your feelings are on that.
Yeah, so mine always gets back at what's the underlying anxiety that the parent's feeling, and how do we tackle that? Usually that comes from, I see that also with people that, again, aren't in a separation and divorce situation that have that feature anyways on. And again, is that healthy for the child or not healthy for the child to have that location feature on? And kids are pretty smart. They ditch their phone, they leave it at their friend's house, and then they go out. So, or they know how to rewire it and do all these different types of things that I don't even pretend to know how to do. So again, how do I talk about that with my clients, with anybody, about what's the underlying anxiety that's going on with them and why they feel the need to do that?
I know I try to tell, I know for myself, I would have hated it as a child if somebody could track where I was. And I think back to being a kid, and I loved the fact that I could go out, and if I wanted to tell my parents where I was, I had to phone them, and they had no idea. And I try to encourage my children that they should get comfortable with the concept of being able to be on their own without mom and dad being able to see where they are. And I know that can be a challenging thing. And I think about just wanting the independence that comes with that. And it scares me a little bit with kids of this generation that they're used to being able to be tracked, and that some of them think it's perfectly fine. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you feel the same way, but I'm a big believer in, as they start to get older, you want to give them that independence.
Yeah, I definitely, it really depends on what people's parenting goals are, right? And so for me, yes, one of my parenting goals is definitely to help my kids flourish and become independent and leave the house eventually. And so for me, that is definitely one of my goals. And so by that, it definitely does not involve using location types of things. It's also teaching kids respect in terms of if they say they're going to be a place, and they need to also tell me if that changes, right? And if they're going to be late or early or anything like that. So it's also teaching them to communicate as opposed to just me relying upon a device to tell me where it's going. But different parents have different goals, right? And so it's sort of figuring out, again, to me, it's always parenting authentically to what your goal is, and matching your behaviors to what you actually are hoping to do.
Well,
and sometimes we don't spend enough time thinking about what our goals are actually as parents, because we're so much in the moment, trying to put out fires or do different things, that we don't take that time that's needed, like you do in a business, and do visioning and try to figure out exactly where are we going.
Well, I think that's a really good point, is thinking of what your goals are. But I think if you ask most parents at the end of the day, you would say you want your children to be able to move out. You want your children to be independent. You want your children to be successful. I think the challenge is in the question of how to get there and overcoming your stress about the safety and security for your child. to let them know that they can be out there. I know one of the comments I hear is, well, I need to have my location settings on because it's safe. What if somebody abducts me or takes me away? And my answer I've always given is, do you really think they're going to let you keep your phone? It's the first thing they're going to take away from you. And if you have your phone with you and you find yourself in a scary place or some situation, you're going to call your mother or father. Yeah. So there's a certain common sense that overrides it, but it's getting through to the child to be able to feel that they can be out and not be followed.
Well, what you're doing is exactly what we do in cognitive behavior therapy, which is how do we challenge our fears that are usually rooted in something that's adaptively normal. As parents, we are supposed to watch out for our young and make sure they're safe. What ends up happening, though, is we take that a little too far and try to control the uncontrollable and the unpredictable world. And so part of therapy in terms of doing that to challenge anxieties is actually countering those thoughts that are unrealistic and having a more balanced one, which would be, if you're going to be kidnapped, they're throwing out your phone first. So having the location on is not going to help. And so then it's acting differently.
And that's exactly it. And it's trying to get that message home. And part of it is getting the message home to both parents to have that parenting goals. And I really like the idea of the way you framed that, of what are your parenting goals, because I actually think, and it's something I haven't seen much of when I see my clients going to an assessment, that in high conflict families, it may be a great idea to ask both parents what their parenting goals are, because I suspect their ultimate goals are probably very similar. And where they're in disagreement is how to get there. And if they really think about how to get there, they may find some commonality to try and be able to move forward and maybe reduce some of the conflict. So I really do like that idea.
Thank you.
I can see from the time that we are just about out of time for this show. So I wanted to say thank you for joining us. I think the time went by very quick, and it was a pleasure having you. For anyone who is interested in learning more about Dr. Wilansky and her practice, you can visit her at www.frameworkcenter.com. And the next Ask Andrew show is on July 15th at 1 p.m. If you have any requests or ideas for future shows, please email them to us at info@feldsteinfamilylaw.com. And thank you for watching.
Thank you so much for having me.